Michael Parker walked through the imposing halls of Parker Enterprises, exuding the confidence of someone who had grown up believing that one day, it would all be his. The glass walls reflected his impeccable image. A well-tailored suit, dark hair perfectly styled, and an air of determination that commanded respect. The meeting he was about to lead was crucial for the future of the company, and Michael knew this was his moment to prove to everyone, especially his father, that he was ready to take the helm. The boardroom was filled with the company's top executives, all seated around a marble table. The atmosphere was tense, but Michael was prepared. He began his presentation, detailing new growth strategies that, in his vision, would take Parker Enterprises to the next level in the market. The projections were ambitious but well-founded, and the charts displayed on the screen behind him highlighted the profit potential of each initiative. As he spoke, his eyes met those of his brother, Richard. Richard had a hard-to-read expression, a mixture of interest and something Michael couldn't quite identify. They were never particularly close, but in recent months, Richard seemed more distant than ever. Michael briefly wondered if his brother was worried about the company's future, or if there was something more. The meeting was a success. The executives seemed convinced, and Michael received praise for his strategic vision. As everyone started to leave, Michael felt a rare sense of satisfaction. He had done his best and was confident that his father would be proud. As he gathered his papers, preparing to leave the room, the door suddenly swung open. Two men, dressed in police uniforms, entered without warning. The sound of their boots echoed in the silent room. Michael frowned, confused. "Michael Parker?" One of them asked in a firm, authoritative voice. "Yes, that's me," Michael responded, stepping forward. "You're under arrest for embezzlement," said the officer, as a pair of handcuffs gleamed in his hand. Michael froze. "This must be a mistake," he tried to argue, but his voice faltered as he saw the severe looks on the officers' faces. His heart raced, and he felt as if the ground was falling out from beneath him. He tried to process the words, but the disbelief was too great. Him, accused of embezzlement? It was inconceivable. His co-workers, who had not yet left the room, stared at him in shock, some whispering among themselves. Before he could say anything else, he felt the cold metal of the handcuffs against his wrists. The reality of the situation hit him like a wave, making him feel exposed and vulnerable in a way he had never experienced before. Michael was led out of the room, walking through the halls where employees watched with expressions of astonishment and horror. As he exited the building, the media was already there, as if they knew what was about to happen. Cameras and microphones were thrust in his direction, and the relentless flashes from photographers blinded his vision. Confusion and panic took hold of Michael, who couldn't comprehend how his life had unraveled so quickly. The cell where Michael was placed was small, dirty, and reeked of mold. The reality of the situation began to settle in, replacing the initial shock with a bitter mix of fear and despair. He sat on the small cot in the cell, his thoughts spinning in endless circles. How had this happened? Who could be behind such a grave accusation? But most of all, why hadn't his family defended him? Hours later, he was called to the visitation room. Michael could hardly believe it when he saw his mother, Margaret, walk in. For a moment, he felt relieved, imagining that she was there to support him, to tell him that everything would be resolved. But the cold expression on Margaret's face was an unexpected blow. She sat across from him, holding the phone with a rigidity that Michael had never seen in her before. "Michael?" she began with a voice that was too calm. "This is unforgivable. What you've done has brought shame to our family. Your father and I have decided that you are no longer part of the Parker family." The impact of her words was devastating. Michael tried to respond, but no words came out. He felt as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. "Do you really think I'm guilty?" he finally managed to ask, his voice weak. "It doesn't matter what I believe," Margaret replied, unmoved. "What matters is what others believe. The company, our reputation, everything is at stake. We can't risk any more scandals. You're on your own now." Michael remained silent, the phone trembling in his hand. He looked at his mother, searching for any sign of compassion, any indication that she still cared. But all he saw was a woman determined to protect her image, at any cost. Margaret stood up, ready to leave. "Goodbye, Michael," were her last words before walking out of the room. Back in the cell, the darkness seemed thicker, more oppressive. Michael felt a wave of despair rise within him. His own family had turned their back on him, disowning him without even hearing his side of the story. Fear began to morph into anger. Someone had orchestrated all of this, and he was determined to find out who. The days in prison dragged on slowly, each second marked by the growing despair that took root in Michael. The anger he initially felt began to transform into a quiet determination. He needed to understand what had happened, but without the resources and contacts that were once at his disposal, that seemed impossible. One afternoon, while sitting in a secluded corner of the yard, Michael was approached by a middle-aged man with graying hair and a look that mixed distrust and curiosity. "Michael Parker, right?" the man asked bluntly. Michael nodded, not recognizing the visitor. "My name is Anthony. I used to work for your family years ago." Michael looked at him, trying to remember, but nothing came to mind. "What do you want?" he asked, trying to maintain a defensive posture. "I know you're here for something you didn't do," Anthony began, his voice low and assured. "I used to be an accountant at Parker Enterprises. I knew the company's finances well, until I was unfairly dismissed. I think you should know that the accusations against you are no coincidence." Michael's heart raced. "What are you saying?" he pressed, now fully attentive. "Someone in your family is pulling the strings to ensure you fall while they rise," Anthony said, choosing his words carefully. "I don't have proof, but I have contacts who told me something was being plotted for months. Your brother, Richard, he's always been involved with the company's finances, hasn't he?" Michael was paralyzed. Richard? The idea that his own brother could be behind all this was almost impossible to believe, but at the same time, several pieces began to fit together. Richard's cold and distant behavior in recent months, the changes in the company. Could it be that Richard had planned everything to remove him from the picture? "Why are you telling me this?" Michael asked, still distrustful. "I was a victim of that family too, but I never had enough power to fight back," Anthony responded, with evident bitterness in his voice. "I saw what happened to you and realized they're willing to sacrifice anyone to maintain control. I thought you deserved to know." Michael felt a mixture of gratitude and horror. If what Anthony said was true, he wasn't just fighting a false accusation but an internal conspiracy. He needed to find out more, he needed proof. But Anthony's words had been the first spark of hope he had felt since it all began. "Thank you for telling me," Michael said, his voice filled with a new determination. "I'm going to uncover the truth, no matter what it takes." Outside, Richard Parker was on a meteoric rise. With Michael out of the picture, he quickly began to assume more responsibilities within the company. Margaret and William, still reeling from the scandal, supported Richard's new position as the emerging leader without hesitation. He seemed perfect for the role. Efficient, dedicated, and, above all, ruthless. However, Richard maintained an impeccable facade. In public, he was the prodigal son, saving the company from his brother's mistakes. In private, he worked tirelessly to consolidate his control. He reviewed contracts, manipulated the finances, and began forming strategic alliances with high-level executives, ensuring that his position within the company was unassailable. During a meeting with the key shareholders, Richard presented a new restructuring plan that promised to significantly cut costs and increase profits. The shareholders, worried about the repercussions of Michael's scandal, were impressed with the clarity and precision of Richard's proposals. He promised a new era for Parker Enterprises, an era where the mistakes of the past would be corrected, and the future would be bright. Margaret watched everything with a mix of pride and relief. She had lost faith in Michael, but Richard seemed to be the answer to all their problems. William, although still hurt by having to disinherit his eldest son, also began to believe that Richard was the true heir the family needed. But Richard was not only interested in power. He had a much deeper goal. He knew that his position was not yet completely secure and that there would always be those who doubted him. He needed something more, something that would guarantee his absolute control, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get it. Behind the scenes, Richard began investigating any potential threats to his dominance. He ordered background checks on former employees, reviewed company records, and, most importantly, monitored any moves Michael might make. He would leave no room for errors. If Michael tried anything, Richard would be ready to crush him once and for all. Meanwhile, Richard's image in the media and within the company continued to grow. He was the hero who had risen from the ashes of a scandal, the savior of Parker Enterprises. But behind that perfect smile and impeccable posture was a man determined to destroy anyone who threatened his new empire, even if that someone was his own brother. Michael felt like he was racing against time. The information Anthony had given him was limited, but enough to fuel his determination. Back in his cell, he began to mentally review every interaction he had with Richard in recent months, searching for signs that he had missed at the time. The more he thought about it, the more it started to make sense. Richard had always been a strategist, but Michael never imagined he was capable of such a deep betrayal. Determined to obtain proof, Michael decided to use what was left of his connections. He managed to contact an old friend, Mark, a private investigator who owed favors to the Parker family but still respected Michael. After a careful exchange of messages, Mark agreed to help Michael in his quest for the truth. Days later, Mark returned with information that confirmed Michael's worst fears. Richard was indeed behind the maneuvers that led to Michael's imprisonment. He had manipulated documents, planted false evidence, and influenced key executives to ensure that the blame fell on Michael. But the most shocking discovery came at the end of Mark's investigation. Richard was not a true Parker. He had been secretly adopted as a child. Mark uncovered that Richard's biological family had been ruined by William Parker's business dealings decades ago. Richard's biological father had lost everything in a hostile takeover that bankrupted his company and eventually led to his death. Richard had ended up in the foster care system until Margaret and William adopted him, never revealing the truth about his past. Michael was stunned by the revelation. Everything began to make sense. Richard's relentless ambition, his emotional distance, and the suppressed hatred he had hidden so well. Richard had spent his entire life planning his revenge, using the very family that adopted him as pawns in his game of destruction. This discovery gave Michael a new perspective. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom but for the survival of the family he still loved, despite everything. Knowing that the truth about Richard could be the key to his redemption, Michael decided that he needed to confront him, but for that, he would have to get out of prison and gather the evidence needed to bring him down once and for all. The prison, which once seemed like an inescapable cage, was now just another obstacle to overcome. Michael knew he couldn't wait for justice, as Richard was always one step ahead in every move. He needed to escape to have a chance to prove his innocence and expose Richard's true intentions. With the help of Mark and some contacts inside the prison, Michael devised a risky plan. He knew he had a small window of opportunity and that any mistake would mean being caught and possibly losing his last chance to clear his name. The tension was palpable as Michael and his accomplices prepared for the escape. On the planned night, Michael executed the plan with precision. During a routine transfer within the prison, he managed to bribe the right guards and, with precise coordination, slipped out of the complex undetected. Every step outside the prison was a risk, but Michael was prepared to face anything. He knew his newly won freedom was fragile and that he needed to act quickly. After escaping, Michael met with Mark in a safe location. There, Mark provided him with the evidence he had gathered: documents, recordings, and testimonies that linked Richard to the manipulations that led to Michael's imprisonment. But that wouldn't be enough. Michael needed more than just evidence. He needed a way to present it in a manner that couldn't be ignored. Meanwhile, the news of Michael's escape began to circulate, causing a stir in the media and within the company. Richard, upon hearing of the escape, went on high alert. He knew that Michael wouldn't flee without a plan, and that the confrontation he had long feared was about to happen. Richard began taking drastic measures to protect his position and ensure that when Michael reappeared, he would be ready to destroy his brother once and for all. Michael, for his part, felt the pressure mounting. He needed to act quickly to unmask Richard before his brother succeeded in eliminating him for good. The stage was set for the final confrontation, and Michael knew that the next move would be decisive. The grand ballroom was aglow with a brilliance that reflected the power and grandeur of Parker Enterprises. The city's business elite flocked to the event, which aimed to officially designate Richard Parker as the new leader of the company. Dressed impeccably, Richard seemed unbeatable, every smile and gesture carefully orchestrated to win the confidence of those present. As Richard prepared to deliver his triumphant speech, Michael moved through the shadows. He had managed to enter the event with Mark's help, disguised as one of the security guards. He knew he had little time to act. The documents and recordings incriminating Richard were ready, but Michael needed the right audience, and the ballroom was filled with shareholders, executives, and journalists. It was the perfect opportunity to expose the whole truth. Richard stepped onto the stage, took the microphone, and began to speak. His words were calculated. Thanking the family for their support and highlighting the bright future he promised for Parker Enterprises under his leadership. But before he could continue, Michael's voice echoed through the ballroom. That future you're promising is built on lies, betrayal, and a conspiracy that almost destroyed this family. All eyes turned to Michael, who had stepped onto the stage with the documents in hand. The shock was visible on Richard's face, who for a brief moment lost his composure. The tension in the ballroom was palpable. "What are you doing here?" Richard tried to maintain his calm, but his voice trembled slightly. Michael advanced. "I'm here to expose the truth about how you planned my downfall, planted evidence, and manipulated everything to get rid of me. But most importantly, I'm here to reveal who you really are." The audience was in absolute silence. Michael threw the documents on the table, showing that Richard had manipulated the company's finances and falsified records to incriminate him. But that wasn't enough. He needed to reveal the true motive behind it all. "Richard isn't a Parker," Michael said, his voice firm and clear. "He was adopted by our family, and his biological parents were destroyed by the business dealings our father conducted. This was all a revenge planned over the years, from the moment he joined this family." Richard, now fully exposed, tried to react. "This is absurd. Don't believe him. He's a fugitive, a criminal." But the audience didn't seem as convinced as before. Michael's evidence passed from hand to hand, and the expressions on the faces of the executives and shareholders began to change. The control Richard had over the situation crumbled with each passing second. Desperate, Richard tried to escape the stage, but Michael was ready to stop him. The security guards, who were once loyal to Richard, hesitated when they saw the evidence before them. They knew that what was happening was bigger than just a family dispute. With the ballroom in a tumult of murmurs and distrustful glances, Richard finally found himself cornered. Before he could escape, the police, alerted by Mark, arrived at the scene. Richard was arrested, and the evidence was presented to the authorities. His meticulously planned ascent had come to a humiliating end. As Richard was led away, Michael remained on the stage, looking out at the crowd. The weight of everything that had happened began to settle on him. The company was safe, but the price had been the complete destruction of his family. With Richard's downfall and the truth finally revealed, Michael was exonerated of the charges that had led to his imprisonment. The media, which once portrayed him as a villain, now depicted him as a survivor of a monumental family betrayal. But despite the restoration of his reputation, Michael didn't feel victorious. Parker Enterprises, though saved from Richard, was shaken. The scandal had tarnished the company's image, and many of the shareholders were uncertain about the future. William and Margaret, devastated by the revelation that Richard was never truly their son, were desolate. The empire they had built with so much effort was in ruins, and Michael knew he couldn't stay to rebuild it. Michael decided that his fight was over. He spent weeks reflecting on his next step, until he finally concluded that he couldn't continue living under the shadow of Parker Enterprises or his family. The Parker legacy was too tainted, and he needed a fresh start. Before leaving the city, Michael met with his parents one last time. William, who had always been cold and distant, now seemed aged, with a vacant look in his eyes. Margaret, who had once been so impassive and calculating, was now broken by the pain of the betrayal. The silence between them was heavy, but filled with mutual understanding. They knew that nothing would ever be the same. "You did what you had to do," William finally said. "I'm sorry I didn't see it earlier." Michael nodded, but he knew that his father's words, though sincere, couldn't heal the deep wounds that had been opened. "I'm leaving," he said, looking at both of them. "I need to start over, far from here. Maybe someday we can understand each other better. But for now, I need to move on." Without waiting for a response, Michael said goodbye and left, feeling the weight of an era closing behind him. He left the city, determined to rebuild his life away from the corruption and shadows that had surrounded him for so long. There was no more inheritance, and for him that was a relief. In the months that followed, Parker Enterprises was restructured, and new leaders took control. The company survived, but the Parker family would never be the same. Michael, for his part, found peace in a new life, far from the glitz and pressures of the empire that almost destroyed him. He knew that the most important battle had been won, the fight for the truth and for his own identity. And now, finally, he was free to be whoever he wanted to be, without the weight of a name that had almost ruined him.